The camera opens on a cluttered desk, littered with papers, an empty coffee cup, and a thick, weathered envelope resting in the center. The sound of a pen clicking echoes in the quiet room. Slowly, the camera zooms in on a letter. The narrator, Jacob Hargrove, gently picks it up, his hands trembling slightly. There's a pause as he stares at it, his face unreadable, but the tension in the air is thick. The envelope is old, yellowed at the edges, and clearly out of place in the otherwise orderly room. Jacob Hargrove. I found a letter my son wrote to his wife. Just a few more months and the inheritance is ours. Keep pretending to care. I wasn't dead. I wasn't even sick. But I was about to become very creative with my will. The words hang in the air and a slow, deliberate silence follows. The camera cuts to Jacob's face as he reads those words again, pain flickering across his expression, betrayal, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sadness all in one. It's the kind of moment that doesn't need explanation. You feel it in the weight of his stare, in the furrow of his brow, in the tightening of his jaw. The audience is left in suspense. The letter is a shocking revelation. His son, his only son, had been faking his love, pretending to care, and now Jacob's forced to reckon with the truth. Aaron had been counting down the months until he could inherit what Jacob had worked so hard to build. The lines between family loyalty and greed have blurred in the most devastating way possible. Jacob sets the letter down slowly on the desk. His hand lingers on it for a moment longer than necessary, as if hoping it would somehow make sense, or perhaps as if he wished it weren't true. But the camera lingers on the letter for just a bit longer, the words printed clearly on the page. The revelation is crystal clear. This isn't just about money, it's about love, trust, and the facade of family. Jacob Hargrove, voiceover. The hardest part? I wasn't even sick. I wasn't dead. But I'd already started making plans. If Aaron thought he could play me, well, I was going to make sure he played himself. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving Jacob in his chair, still processing the enormity of what he's just discovered. But the silence is broken with a softer, almost unsettling chuckle, a quiet moment of realization. This is the turning point in his life, where everything changes. Jacob's no longer the passive observer in his own life. He's about to take control in a way that no one would expect. Jacob Hargrove. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The screen fades briefly, then fades back into the story. It's an odd moment, one that feels like a casual invitation into a conversation, but it also reflects the quiet power Jacob's about to reclaim. The contrast between his calm, even tone and the storm brewing inside him is palpable. You can sense the calm before the storm. It's the start of a new chapter, one filled with betrayal, heartache, and ultimately a plan to reclaim not just what's his by law, but what he's lost emotionally. Aaron thought he was playing the game. Little did he know Jacob was about to rewrite the rules. Before all of this, life was normal, comfortable even. I had everything I ever wanted, a successful business, a home filled with the laughter of my children and grandchildren, and a son, Aaron, who I thought would one day take the reins. I had always done everything for him, put in the late nights, built the empire with my own two hands. I didn't just want to pass down wealth, I wanted to pass down values, hard work, and loyalty. But I never imagined that the very son I'd raised would turn out to be someone who'd see me not as a father, but as a resource. At the time, things seemed perfect. Sunday afternoons were sacred. I'd host the family for dinner, usually something simple but hearty, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the same recipes that had been passed down through the generations. My wife, Carol, would set the table, making everything look just right. The kids would run around the yard while the adults sat and talked about everything from politics to the latest family gossip. It was always warm, always together. Aaron would show up with his wife, Megan, and their kids. The laughter of our grandkids filled the house. And for a moment, life felt complete. Aaron was my only son, and I made sure he knew how much he meant to me. He wasn't just my son, he was my legacy. Megan, sweet as she was, seemed to fit right in. She always had a smile on her face, complimenting Carol's cooking and telling me how much she admired the way I'd built everything from the ground up. I like to think of her as the daughter I never had. She seemed genuine, like she truly appreciated the family bond we had worked so hard to create. It was the image of a perfect family. 2 kids, a solid marriage, and no real problems in sight. It wasn't just about appearances. I made sure Aaron knew that I trusted him, that I was preparing him for the day I couldn't run the business anymore. He was my right hand, the person I thought would one day continue the Hargrove legacy. I took him under my wing, shared everything with him, every deal, every negotiation, every tough decision I'd made over the years. He always seemed eager, enthusiastic even, like he was ready to learn, ready to take over. We had long talks about the future, about what I wanted for the family once I was gone. My plan was simple. The business, the property, everything I had worked so hard for would go to him. He was going to carry the Hargrove name forward. I had no reason to think anything would change, no reason to believe that he wasn't as invested in our family as I was. Looking back now, I see the cracks, though they were small at the time. Nothing too alarming, just subtle hints that things weren't as perfect as I had believed. It was the little things that I brushed off. Moments when Aaron seemed distracted, or when his conversations about the future started sounding more like financial projections than personal connections. But those moments were rare, easily ignored, or dismissed as harmless ambition. Life felt secure, safe, and I had no reason to question that. But in the back of my mind, I now wonder how many of those moments were signs I missed. How many of those times were actually seeds of something darker that I never even saw coming. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no heated argument or confrontation. It was subtle, a passing comment, almost innocent on the surface, but in hindsight, it was the first crack in the facade. I remember it clearly. It was one of those late afternoon family barbecues in the backyard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything, and the kids were playing in the pool. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying a cold beer and chatting with a few family members when Aaron walked up, his face lit up by that familiar smile of his. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing out of the ordinary, but then he said something that stuck with me, something that didn't sit right in my gut. "Aaron, how's work going? Everything okay with the business?" I asked, genuinely interested. I'd always been the one to check in, to make sure he was feeling supported, to ensure that he felt ready to take on more responsibility in the company. He gave me that half grin, the one he often used when he was trying to downplay something. "Yeah, it's good, Dad. You know, just a matter of time before it all falls into place." I nodded, but then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "I mean, you're not getting any younger. I guess you'll need to hand over the reins soon, huh?" The way he said it wasn't rude, not in the traditional sense. It was casual, almost offhand. But there was something cold about the tone, a lack of genuine warmth. It wasn't the words themselves that struck me so much as the implication behind them. It wasn't about me as a father, it was about me as a resource, a stepping stone to something bigger. A realization that I wasn't being considered in this equation for who I was, but for what I had. For a moment, I just stared at him, unsure of what to say. It was as if a veil had lifted, and I suddenly saw Aaron not as my son, but as a man with a very different agenda than I had imagined. "Well, we'll talk about that when the time comes," I replied, trying to brush it off. But inside, something shifted. I felt the first sting of doubt, the first flicker of concern that perhaps Aaron wasn't as invested in the family, or in me, as I had always believed. That conversation stayed with me long after the barbecue was over. I went to bed that night, tossing and turning, thinking about it. It wasn't like Aaron to be so blunt, so cold. We'd always had a close relationship, one built on trust and mutual respect, but this felt like something different. A hint of impatience, a desire for something more. I tried to dismiss it at first. I told myself that maybe I was just reading too much into it, that he was just stressed with the business and trying to keep things moving forward. After all, Aaron had always been driven, maybe a little too focused at times. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Looking back now, that comment was the first warning, the first crack that started to spread through everything I thought was solid. It was a moment of emotional distance, a flicker of selfish ambition hiding behind the surface, and I was too blind to see it for what it was. In that moment, I should have asked more questions, probed deeper into what Aaron was really thinking. But I didn't. I dismissed it, thinking it was just a harmless comment. And that, I think, was my biggest mistake. The small cracks that I had brushed off in the beginning slowly turned into deeper fractures, and what had once been a stable, loving relationship with my son began to erode quietly. At first, it was nothing I could pinpoint exactly, a series of little moments, a change in behavior here, a distant look there. But soon, the weight of it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't like we were fighting. There were no shouting matches or angry words. No, this was a quieter, more insidious kind of disconnect. Aaron stopped coming over as often. The Sunday dinners we once shared were no longer a given. He and Megan would show up occasionally, but the visits became shorter, more scheduled, more convenient. I began to notice that when he did come, there was a distance between us, like he was always somewhere else in his mind, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with family. I remember one evening, a few months after the barbecue, when I called him to check in. It was a Wednesday, just a quick chat, to see how things were going with the business. "Hey, Aaron, how's everything on your end?" I asked, expecting the usual enthusiastic reply, the kind he used to give about his latest projects and ambitions. But this time his response was flat. "Yeah, it's fine. Busy. You know how it is." There was a pause, and then he changed the subject quickly. "I was thinking of taking a few days off next week, maybe go out of town with Megan. I'll need to check the schedule." "Okay, sure," I said, trying to sound casual. But the conversation felt hollow. He wasn't asking about me, about Carol, or anything to do with our family. It was all business, or more accurately, his own world. It wasn't just the lack of conversation that stung. It was the absence of warmth, the way his voice had become distant, like he was speaking to a colleague, not a father. It wasn't malicious, it was just empty, and it left me feeling like I was an afterthought in his life. Carol noticed it too. She mentioned it a few times, the way Aaron didn't seem as interested in spending time with us. At first, I brushed it off, thinking she was just being overly sensitive. But the truth was, I had begun to feel the same way. Even when Aaron was present, he wasn't really there. I recall a day when Carol and I had arranged a small family outing, a trip to the lake, just a way to spend some time together. Aaron and Megan were supposed to join us, but at the last minute, Aaron called to say they couldn't make it. He didn't explain why, just that they were too busy with work. And even though I told myself it wasn't personal, something inside me started to crack. In the weeks that followed, it became a pattern. Small acts of neglect, subtle but increasingly frequent. Texts went unanswered, calls were returned late, and the tone of his messages started to shift. Short, impersonal, like he had more important things to do. The weight of it all began to settle into me, like I was being slowly erased from his life. I tried to talk to him about it, but he always had an excuse. "Work's been crazy, Dad. You know how it is." But deep down, I could tell that wasn't it. It wasn't just that he was busy. It was that he wasn't making an effort anymore, no effort to connect, no effort to maintain the bond we once had. The emotional toll of all this neglect wore me down in ways I hadn't expected. I began to feel invisible. I wasn't angry, not yet, but the quiet hurt was deep. I had given everything for my family, sacrificed so much to make sure they had what they needed, and now it felt like it meant nothing. And what hurt the most was that it wasn't just Erin. It was Megan, too. She had been so warm, so kind when we first met. Now she seemed to be part of this growing distance, her smiles becoming more forced, her conversations with Carol more superficial. It was like watching something I had built with love slowly disintegrate piece by piece, and I couldn't do a thing to stop it. It wasn't until the family reunion that the real sting of Erin's indifference hit me. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in late summer, the kind of day we used to cherish. The whole family had gathered at our house for a celebration of Carol's birthday. I could smell the food, Carol's famous potato salad, my grilled steaks, and hear the chatter of the kids running around in the yard. For a moment, everything seemed almost normal, like it had been before. But it was that night at the dinner table that everything shifted into sharp focus. We were all sitting around the table, the atmosphere as jovial as ever. Erin, Megan, and their kids were there, along with Carol's sister and her husband, some old friends of ours, and a few of the neighbors. The conversation was lively, people sharing old stories, catching up on their lives. I'd been telling a funny story about a business trip I'd taken years ago, one that everyone always seemed to enjoy. As I recounted how I'd managed to survive a ridiculous series of events involving a misplaced suitcase and a mix-up at a fancy hotel, I noticed Erin quietly rolling his eyes from across the table. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, who didn't get a little tired of hearing the same stories over and over? But then, as I finished, Erin spoke up. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chatter like a knife. "Dad, do you really have to tell that story every time? I mean, I've heard it 1,000 times," he said, a slight smirk playing on his lips. There was a collective pause in the room. The table went silent for a moment as everyone turned their attention toward Erin, and I felt my chest tighten. The tone in his voice was dismissive, even patronizing. The once adoring son who had hung on my every word now seemed annoyed by the sound of my voice, irritated by my presence in front of everyone. I tried to brush it off with a smile, but it was like the room had shifted. People awkwardly looked at one another, unsure of how to react. Carol, sitting next to me, glanced at me with a faint, concerned expression, but she didn't say anything. I could feel her discomfort, but I also knew she didn't want to draw attention to the growing tension between Erin and me. I forced a chuckle. "I guess it's just one of those stories that sticks with me," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But the damage had already been done. Erin's comment wasn't just about the story. It was about me. His way of diminishing me in front of others, of making me feel small. I could sense the awkwardness at the table. The others didn't know how to react, and some even shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a public humiliation, and it felt like everyone was watching as my son chipped away at my dignity. I'd never imagined Erin would speak to me like that, especially not in front of everyone. It wasn't just a joke or a simple criticism, it was a clear statement that he didn't respect me, that I no longer held any value in his eyes. And that realization hit me harder than anything he had ever said before. I wasn't just being overlooked anymore, I was being dismissed, as if I was a joke in his life. I wanted to say something, anything, to defend myself, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to make a scene, especially not in front of the others. So I sat there quietly, feeling the sting of his disrespect burn deep within me, knowing that the relationship I had once cherished had already begun to unravel, even if no one else could see it. That night, after the family dinner, I found myself staring at the walls of our house, trying to make sense of everything. The laughter of the kids, the clinking of silverware, all of it felt so distant now. Carol could sense it too. I didn't even have to say anything. She saw it in my eyes. There was an unspoken understanding between us. We both knew that something had shifted in Erin, something deep and unspoken, and it had begun to show. The next few weeks only confirmed what I had begun to feel. Aaron's visits grew more infrequent, and when he did come by, it was always on his terms. There were always excuses, work, meetings, events, things that pulled him away from the family. Megan, too, seemed more distant. She'd smile and nod, but her eyes were elsewhere, just like Aaron's. It was as if we were becoming invisible to them. Then came the phone call that pushed me to a breaking point. It was one of those moments you know you'll never forget, even though it seems like a small thing in the grand scheme. Aaron called me one afternoon, and for the first time in a while, I thought maybe he was reaching out. Maybe he was ready to talk, to reconnect. I picked up the phone, my heart briefly lifting at the sound of his voice. "Hey, Dad," Aaron said, but his voice lacked the warmth it once had. "So, Megan and I were talking, and we think it's time we take a step back from family stuff for a while. You know, we're just really busy, and with the new house, we need to focus on that." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no, "we miss you," no, "I'll make more time for you." It wasn't a request for space, it was an announcement. They were pulling away from us entirely, from the family, from everything that once mattered. I could almost hear the finality in Aaron's tone. "We've been thinking it through, and I think it's just better if we don't make any big plans for the next few months. You get it, right?" he asked, as if this was the most logical decision, as if he were explaining some necessary business move. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much this hurt, how much I had done for him. But another part of me knew that it wouldn't matter. It was as if the son I had raised, the son I had sacrificed for, had disappeared. What was left was a stranger, someone who didn't care. "I understand," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Aaron quickly wrapped up the call, saying something about needing to get back to work. And just like that, the conversation was over. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, feeling like everything I had built, every moment I had invested in my son, was slipping through my fingers. Carol and I didn't talk much about it that night. We sat in silence, each of us processing our own grief. I could tell she was hurting too, but we both knew there was no point in fighting it. Aaron had made his decision. The painful reality was that he didn't need us anymore. I wasn't angry, not yet. But a deep, hollow ache settled in my chest. I wasn't just being pushed aside. I was being erased from their lives, quietly and without fanfare. I realized then that the man I had hoped would one day carry on my legacy was already moving on without me, leaving me behind in the dust. And as much as it hurt, I knew something had to change. I couldn't just keep pretending everything was fine. Something inside me, some quiet spark of resistance, began to grow. I wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The pain of it all sat heavily on me, but it also lit a fire I didn't expect. I wouldn't allow myself to be discarded without a second thought. The next chapter of this story was about to begin, and I would be the one to write it. The following weeks felt like a slow descent. It wasn't just the absence of Aaron and Megan that hurt, it was everything that followed. I wasn't angry at first. I told myself that people grow, that it was normal for children to pull away as they become adults, start families of their own. But this wasn't just pulling away. This was being left in the dust, as if I was no longer important, and that realization stung deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't long before Carol and I began to feel the weight of it all. The quiet in the house was deafening. We would sit together, me in my chair, her at the kitchen table, both of us lost in our thoughts. Every Sunday, instead of the usual family gathering, it was just the two of us. No Aaron, no Megan, no grandkids running through the house. Carol would make her famous roast, but it was just for us, 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine. It felt like we were living in a memory, clinging to something that no longer existed. The real turning point, though, came when I had a health scare. It was one of those things that hit you out of nowhere, No warning signs, just a sudden feeling of pressure in my chest, like someone had wrapped a vice around my ribs. I thought it was nothing at first, probably stress. But Carol insisted I go to the doctor, and I begrudgingly agreed. The diagnosis was minor, a small heart issue that would need some medication and lifestyle changes, but it was enough to shake me. I remember sitting in that sterile exam room, the doctor talking to me about my heart and my health, but all I could think about was how I hadn't heard from Aaron, how I had tried calling him to let him know about the appointment, and how his voicemail had greeted me as coldly as ever. I left the doctor's office that day with a prescription in my hand, but my heart was heavier than it had ever been. I called Aaron that evening, thinking maybe this time he would answer, maybe this time he would care enough to check in. But again, nothing. I was left with nothing but silence on the other end of the line. That was the moment it all hit me, the full weight of being forgotten. I was facing my own mortality, and the one person who should have cared wasn't even picking up the phone. It wasn't just the physical pain that crushed me, it was the emotional toll of being so utterly alone, even though I wasn't truly alone. Carol was there, but it wasn't the same. She was grieving too, in her own way. We had been through so much together, but even she couldn't fill the void left by Aaron's absence. I realized that day that I had been holding on to a lie, pretending everything was fine, when, in reality, I was standing on the edge of something far deeper and darker than I had ever imagined. I wasn't just dealing with a distant son or a strained relationship. I was facing the reality of a life I hadn't planned for, one where my own flesh and blood didn't care enough to even show up. That was my rock bottom. And yet, as much as it hurt, something else was beginning to stir within me, a quiet, burning resolve. I couldn't stay here, wallowing in this emptiness. Something had to change. I had to take back control, the pain, the loss. It had to mean something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. I hadn't planned to go through Aaron's things. After everything that had happened, I never imagined I'd find myself digging through his old room at the house, his old room that had been left untouched for months. But one afternoon, when the loneliness was starting to wear me thin, I decided to clear some of the clutter in the house. Carol had asked me to look through a few old boxes in the attic, and as I sifted through the piles of paperwork and forgotten knickknacks, something caught my eye. It was an envelope tucked underneath a stack of bills. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Aaron's. I pulled it out, my heart already racing, unsure of why it felt so urgent to open it. I hadn't seen him write anything personal in months, not since he'd started pulling away. The letter had a sense of finality about it, even before I'd cracked the seal. At first I hesitated. I shouldn't have been going through his things, and yet something told me I needed to know. If there was any chance left for reconciliation, any shred of hope I had been holding on to, I needed to see if he still cared. So I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The words hit me like a freight train. Just a few more months and the inheritance is ours. Keep pretending to care. I had to read it again, slower this time, to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands shaking as I held the letter. It wasn't a long message, just a few short sentences, but they were enough to crush everything I thought I knew about my son. Aaron, my only son, the person I had sacrificed so much for, the person I believed I had raised with the same values I had lived by, had been playing a game, and I was the pawn. As I read those words again, I felt a mix of emotions swirl inside me: shock, anger, disbelief, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about the inheritance, it was about the deception, the fake love he had shown me all these years. It wasn't enough to just neglect me. No, he had been lying to my face, pretending to care, all for the sake of securing what he thought was rightfully his. For the first time in a long while, I felt the power of anger rise within me. I had been a fool to think he had any real affection for me. All this time, I had been blinded by the love of a father for his son, never imagining that my son had been scheming in the shadows. I was furious, yes, but I also realized something else, something that gave me a flicker of clarity. This betrayal didn't have to define me. I didn't have to be a victim in this story. I could still change the narrative. With the letter in my hand, I knew something had to be done. And it wouldn't be just about the money or the inheritance. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my power, and my legacy. Aaron had underestimated me, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The letter felt like a heavy weight in my hand. But as the shock wore off, something else began to stir within me, a quiet, simmering rage, but more importantly, a renewed sense of clarity. I had been living in the shadow of Aaron's indifference for so long, convincing myself that things would eventually get better, that maybe it was just a phase, that he would come around. But no, this was the final confirmation. My son didn't just stop caring. He had been manipulating me from the start, pretending to love me, all for a piece of what I had built. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of the discovery was too much. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt a strange kind of energy bubbling up inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something stronger. It was the spark of a decision that would change everything. I thought about the family I had created, the life I had worked so hard for. I thought about Carol, who had supported me through every high and low, who had seen this betrayal as clearly as I had. But it wasn't just about her. It was about me. I wasn't going to let Aaron or anyone else take what I had worked for without a fight. The next morning, I went to the office early, something I hadn't done in a while. I sat down at my desk, and for the first time in months, I felt in control. There were still papers to go through, business dealings to attend to, and decisions to be made. But it wasn't just the business that needed my attention. It was my will. I had been putting off updating it for years, assuming everything would pass on smoothly to Aaron. But now, I knew better. I reached out to my lawyer, someone I had worked with for years, and made an appointment for the following day. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not Carol, not anyone. It wasn't because I didn't trust them. It was because I knew this was something I needed to do on my own. I had spent my life making decisions for others, for my family, for my business. It was time to make a decision for myself, one that would change everything. As I sat at my desk, I started drafting the changes I would make to my will. The more I wrote, the more empowered I felt. I wasn't just leaving behind money or property, I was leaving behind the illusion of my son's affection. Aaron had shown me who he truly was, and I wasn't going to let his greed dictate the future. The new will would ensure that Aaron didn't get a dime, not a single thing. Instead, I decided to leave the business to someone who had been loyal, someone who had supported me for years, without any expectation of gain. The charities I had always intended to support would receive the bulk of my assets, and the house, my family home, would go to Carol. It felt right. It felt just. This was my moment of awakening. I had been living for so long under the weight of my family's expectations, and now I was going to live for myself, for the legacy I had built, not for the one Aaron wanted to steal. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a reclaiming of power that would be felt far beyond the walls of my office. I wasn't just going to let this happen. I was going to rewrite the end of my story, and this time I would be the one in control. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose, a quiet determination that had been missing from my life. The days that followed my decision were filled with a steady, almost mechanical routine. It was as though the moment I had made that choice to change the course of my life, everything else fell into place. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, they all became secondary to the action I was now taking. I wasn't going to let Aaron win, not in the way he thought he could. I didn't tell Carol what I was doing, at least not at first. She knew something was different. She could see it in my eyes, in the way I carried myself, but I hadn't yet found the words to explain it. She was still reeling from the coldness Aaron and Megan had shown us, still holding on to the hope that things would, one day, go back to normal. I didn't want to shatter that hope completely, not yet. But I also knew that what I was doing wasn't something I could keep hidden for long. I began working quietly, meticulously, behind the scenes. Every morning I'd get up early and head to the office, sometimes not coming home until late in the evening. It wasn't that the business was falling apart, far from it. In fact, the more I focused on it, the more successful it seemed to become. But my attention was no longer on just keeping the company afloat or securing the next big deal. My focus had shifted. I met with my lawyer, a trusted friend for decades, and began drafting the changes to my will. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I couldn't leave Aaron anything. He had shown me who he really was, and there was no coming back from that. The business that I had built wasn't just a legacy, it was my life's work. It deserved someone who cared about it, someone who valued loyalty and integrity, not someone who would exploit it for personal gain. I made sure to include a clause in the new will that would leave Aaron out completely. No inheritance, no business, no part of the estate. Instead, I chose someone who had been loyal to me over the years, someone who had worked alongside me without ever asking for anything in return. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. I wanted to make a statement that the things that truly mattered to me, the things I'd built with love and hard work, would never fall into the hands of someone who didn't appreciate them. The charities I had supported throughout my life would receive the bulk of my wealth. And as for Carol, she would have the house, the place where our family had created memories, where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and the quiet, beautiful moments that made our lives meaningful. Every decision I made felt right, but it was still done in silence. I wasn't going to announce this to anyone, not yet. I didn't need validation or sympathy. What I needed was control over my own fate. I had been too passive for too long. The new will would be my declaration that I wasn't just a man waiting to be discarded by his own son. I was a man who would reclaim his dignity, and if it meant doing it without family or with only a few left to trust, then so be it. Each day, as I walked through the motions of normal life, I carried the weight of my decisions like a quiet armor. The world didn't know yet what was coming, but I did, and the power was already shifting in my hands. As the weeks went by, I began to notice subtle changes in the way people reacted to me. It was as though a shift had occurred, not just in my own life, but in the lives of those around me. The silence between Aaron and me, which had once been a source of pain, began to feel like a kind of power, one I wasn't sure I had the courage to wield before. But now I knew I had no choice. I wasn't begging for his attention anymore, wasn't waiting for his approval. I was standing in a space where I was no longer the weak link in the chain, I was the one holding the reins. It wasn't just Aaron who noticed the change. The people in my life, the ones who had quietly observed the tension building between us, began to see me differently. At the office, my employees stopped walking on eggshells around me. There was a subtle but noticeable shift in the way they engaged with me. Where there had been a hesitation in the past, perhaps because of my growing distance from Aaron or my tendency to be a bit withdrawn, they now came to me with new respect, a renewed sense of loyalty. My confidence was palpable. Every decision I made, no matter how small, seemed to ripple outward, giving the impression that I was more focused, more assertive, more alive than I had been in a long time. It was as though the mask I had worn for years, the one that showed me as the benevolent father, the doting patriarch, the man who could be relied upon, had slipped away. Now I was no longer the man who just gave without question. Now I was the man who took control. I wasn't seeking anyone's permission. I was simply moving forward with a quiet authority, and the people around me began to sense it. Even Carol, who had been so uncertain about everything that had happened with Aaron, started to see the transformation. She didn't need to be told. She could see it in my eyes. in the way I stood taller, the way I spoke with more conviction. She began to smile more. Not the nervous smile she'd been giving me in the past few months, but real smiles, genuine, warm, and confident. For the first time, we were in this together. I had stopped being a passive bystander in my own life, and yet there was a sense of stillness about it all, a quiet calm. I wasn't fighting back in a loud, dramatic way. No, that wasn't my style. My power lay in my silence, in my refusal to engage in any more of Aaron's games. I was becoming someone who no longer needed his approval. I was moving on, not just emotionally, but in every sense. I had already made the hard decisions, and the next steps were already falling into place. Aaron, for his part, had no idea what was coming. His calls were still few and far between, always curt, always centered around business, never about family. But with every passing day, I realized I wasn't waiting for him anymore. He had chosen his path, and I had chosen mine. The power had shifted, and the more I embraced it, the more I understood just how much control I had over my own destiny. I didn't need to prove anything to Aaron. What I needed was to prove to myself that I could stand on my own, that I was capable of making my own decisions without relying on anyone else's validation. The pieces were falling into place, and it wasn't just about the will or the business anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my peace of mind, and my future. And as I moved forward, I knew one thing for certain. The storm that was coming would be one of my own making. The time had finally come. The quiet power I had been building, the control I had been taking back, could no longer stay in the shadows. Aaron had been out of touch for weeks, only reaching out when he needed something, usually related to business. His calls were short, impersonal, almost robotic. It became clear to me that he wasn't interested in reconnecting, and I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine anymore. The decision had been made. I called Aaron one evening, my voice calm but firm. Carol sat beside me, her presence a quiet comfort, but I knew this was a conversation I had to have alone with my son. She had no place in this discussion, and though I could see the concern in her eyes, she understood. This was something I had to face head on. "Hey, Aaron, we need to talk," I said when he picked up the phone. There was no pleasantry, no preamble. The tension between us had reached a point where there was no room for small talk. "Dad, what's up?" His voice was as detached as ever, but I could hear a slight edge, as if he was preparing for another one of our uncomfortable silences. It was obvious that he didn't think anything serious was coming. "I know what you've been doing," I said, and the words hit the air with the weight of truth. "I know about the letter, about everything. You and Megan plotting behind my back, pretending to care, all for the inheritance. I read it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment I thought he might hang up or say something to deflect, but instead there was silence. And that silence spoke volumes. "Dad." "I don't know what you're talking about," Aaron finally said, his tone defensive, almost too calm. "I think you do," I replied, my voice unwavering. "And I think you've been playing a game I'm not a part of anymore. You've been pretending to care, pretending to be the good son, all for what's coming when I'm gone. But I'm not dead yet, Aaron, and I'm not going to let you take what I've built. Not anymore." His response was the same as it always had been, an excuse wrapped in a lie. "I didn't mean it like that, Dad. You know I care about you. Things have been busy. Megan and we've got a lot going on." I cut him off before he could continue, the truth rising inside me like a tide I couldn't hold back. "It's too late for that, Aaron. I've already made my decisions. The business, the inheritance, everything, it's all been reassigned. You're out. I'm not leaving it to someone who doesn't even care enough to show up, much less be there for the family." There was another long silence, this time heavier. I could almost feel the shock on the other end of the line, but I didn't care. "You've made your bed," I said, my voice steady. "Now, you'll have to lie in it." And with that, I ended the call. It wasn't dramatic, There was no yelling, no sweeping gestures. But in that moment, I felt something inside me shift for the last time. I had finally said the words I had been holding on to for far too long. The air between us would never be the same. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't need to explain myself. Aaron's betrayal was out in the open, and my decisions were final. There was no going back from this. I had confronted the truth head on, and now it was out in the world for him to process. I had finally reclaimed my own space, my own narrative, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The next steps would be his to take, or not. But I was no longer waiting for him. I was moving forward, with or without him. The weeks after my confrontation with Aaron were quiet. Too quiet, in fact. I had expected some kind of reaction, perhaps a heated response, a desperate plea, or even a confrontation. But there was nothing. The phone calls stopped. No texts, no visits. It was as if he had disappeared into the void, as if he had accepted the truth without a fight. The silence was almost as heavy as the betrayal itself. But I wasn't left wondering for long. The truth always finds its way to the surface. It was a Friday morning when I received the call from my lawyer. His voice was calm but firm, and the news he delivered shook me more than I expected. "Jacob," he began, "I need to let you know something important. Aaron has filed a claim against your will." My heart skipped a beat. It was the last thing I had expected. Aaron had been silent, distant, hadn't said a word since our conversation. And yet, here he was, taking legal action against me, trying to undo everything I had planned, to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. At first I felt a surge of anger. How dare he? After everything, after the letter, after his coldness, after all the lies, he still thought he could take what wasn't his. But then, as the initial shock began to wear off, something else settled in. I wasn't just angry, I was calm, too calm. It was in that moment that I realized something. Aaron had just made his biggest mistake. He had underestimated me. In the silence, in the quiet resolve I had shown after our conversation, he had thought I was weak, that I was passive. He thought he could use the law to get his way, to somehow force me to change my mind. But the twist, the justice that was about to unfold, was something he hadn't seen coming. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't lash out, didn't rush to the courts to argue my case. Instead, I took my time. I let the situation sit with me, letting the finality of my decisions sink in. I had already made my peace with the choices I had made. The will had been written, the documents had been signed, and everything was legally binding. Aaron's attempt to challenge it was just another act of desperation, another feeble attempt to get what he thought he deserved. But here's where the justice came in. As I sat with my lawyer reviewing the claim, I realized that Aaron had made a critical mistake in the language he had used to challenge the will. He had assumed that his claim to the inheritance was a given, that he could simply waltz in and take what he felt entitled to. But in doing so, he had overlooked one crucial detail. The new will had been drafted in such a way that any challenge on those grounds would be almost impossible to win. It wasn't just about who would get the money, it was about who deserved it. Aaron's claim fell apart almost immediately in court. His attempt to manipulate the legal system backfired spectacularly. And as I sat in that courtroom, watching it unfold, I realized that what had started as a devastating betrayal had turned into a poetic form of justice. Aaron's greed, his deception, and his arrogance had cost him everything. What he had hoped to claim, he now lost. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of true justice, one that wasn't about revenge, but about the simple truth of the situation. Aaron had tried to take what wasn't his, and in the end, it had all slipped through his fingers. The final twist wasn't just legal, it was personal. Aaron had underestimated the power of my resolve, and in doing so, he had ensured that he would walk away with nothing. Nothing except the knowledge that sometimes the people you betray aren't as helpless as you think. It wasn't long after Aaron's failed claim that I heard from him again. This time, the call wasn't cold or distant. There was a trace of desperation in his voice, something that hadn't been there before. For the first time in months, he was reaching out, and I could feel the difference. The arrogance, the sense of entitlement that had defined him for so long, was gone. In its place was a faint but unmistakable humility. "Dad," he began, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "I know I messed up. I don't know what I was thinking. I was angry. And I guess I thought I could fix it, but I was wrong. I'm sorry." I wasn't sure what I expected when I picked up the phone, but it certainly wasn't this. For a moment I was silent, just listening to the way his words hung in the air, thick with regret. He didn't sound like the man I had confronted weeks earlier, the one who had been so consumed by greed and ambition. He sounded small, vulnerable. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued. "I know I've hurt you and I don't know how to make it right. But I want to try. I don't want to lose you." I could hear the desperation in his voice now, the realization that he had crossed a line he might never be able to come back from. And that realization, strangely enough, shifted something inside me. For the first time, I wasn't just the victim of his betrayal. I wasn't someone who needed to be rescued. I had already made my peace with the truth, and now it was up to him to prove that he could be a son worth having. I didn't answer immediately. The silence between us was long enough for Aaron to probably think I had hung up, but I wasn't sure what to say. What could I say? The damage was done, and yet part of me understood that this was his attempt to repair what he had broken. But another part of me, probably the part that had suffered the most, was still unsure. Could I really welcome him back into my life after everything? Could I just pretend that his actions hadn't shattered the foundation of trust we had built over the years? "Why now?" I finally asked. The question had been lingering in my mind since the moment the call began, and I needed an answer. "Why didn't you try this sooner? Why didn't you think about this before?" He hesitated before answering, and I could hear the weight of the truth in his words. "I guess I didn't know what I was losing until it was almost gone. I took you for granted, Dad. I thought you'd always be there, that I'd always have time to fix things. But I don't, do I?" I sat there, digesting his words. In some ways, they were what I had wanted to hear all along: the apology, the acknowledgement of his mistake, the admission that he had been wrong. But in other ways, they didn't erase the years of neglect, the cold distance he had put between us. Could I ever fully forgive him for that? I took a deep breath and let the silence stretch between us, not out of anger, but out of the realization that this wasn't a simple answer. I had to choose whether to let him back into my life or leave him where he had put himself, outside of it. "I'm listening," I finally said. The words weren't a promise of forgiveness, but they were an invitation, a chance for him to show me that he was ready to be the man I thought he could be. The conversation wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward something new, something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of cautious hope, unsure of what would happen next, but ready to face it, whatever it was. The days that followed Aaron's call were filled with a quiet, simmering contemplation. It wasn't just about whether or not I could forgive him. That question had been haunting me ever since the betrayal first came to light. No, it was about something deeper, something I had been avoiding for years without even realizing it. It was about my own transformation. In the weeks after the legal battle, after I had finally made the decision to cut ties with Aaron, I started noticing things, little things, changes in myself, in the way I saw the world, in the way I moved through my daily life. The man I had been before, the one who had blindly given and sacrificed, who had quietly accepted his role as the family patriarch, the one whose identity had been tied to the approval of his son, was gone. And in his place was someone different, someone stronger, more certain. I stood in my garden one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the yard. It was a quiet evening, the kind I had once taken for granted. But this time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that came from appeasing others, not the kind that relied on anyone else's approval, but the kind that came from deep within. I thought about the past, the years I'd spent working, raising my family, building the business. I thought about how everything I had done was meant to be passed on, meant to be a legacy, but how I had lost sight of what that really meant. My legacy wasn't just about what I could leave behind in material wealth. It wasn't about the business, the house, the money. It was about who I had become in the process. The moment I had read that letter, Aaron's letter, I had been crushed, no doubt about it. But that moment had been a turning point, a wake-up call that had forced me to see just how much I had been sacrificing, just how much of myself I had been giving away. In trying to build a legacy, I had lost sight of the most important thing, my own sense of self. Now I understood. I had spent years thinking that my worth was tied to my ability to give, to serve, to always be there for others. But in doing so, I had allowed myself to become invisible. I had allowed myself to be taken for granted. I didn't need Aaron's approval, or anyone else's for that matter. What mattered now was that I was in control of my own life again. I had taken back my dignity, my power, and most importantly, my peace. I thought about the conversations I'd had with Carol during this whole ordeal. She had been my constant, my rock. She had seen the pain I had been hiding, but she had also seen me grow. She knew I wasn't the same man who had let people walk all over him. I was someone different now, someone stronger. And no matter what happened with Aaron, I would be okay. As the sky turned from golden to a deep purple, I stood there in silence, taking in the beauty of the moment. I didn't need any more answers. I didn't need closure, not in the way I had once thought. The closure was in me, in the way I had found my own voice, my own strength, and had begun to live for myself, not for anyone else. And with that, I knew I had finally reclaimed my life, not in a way that was grand or dramatic, but in a way that was deep and true. I had found the peace I had been searching for all along.